welcome you. This is Live with Drew, and this is a short 30-minute live broadcast here to really answer a lot of questions that I get from viewers like you who watch my LinkedIn courses, as well as students and clients. If you know me, then you know that I'm an author for LinkedIn with a variety of courses in different topics, mainly creativity and innovation. I also teach courses in branding and marketing, as well as sales leadership and key account management. And today's broadcast is simply around creativity and innovation, specifically with the issues around the pandemic. What are the issues that people are facing because of the pandemic, and what should you be thinking about? Now, the good news is we're coming out of this pandemic, which is great. But there still has been a lot of adjustment to people's work styles, to people's day in and day out activities, how they relate with their colleagues. So all I wanted to do is discuss with you three things that I continue to get questions about, concerns that I hear, and I want to talk about those. If you have questions, you certainly are welcome to contact me through LinkedIn if you're one of the members here, or if you would like to email me directly, that would be great too. Drew@drewboyd.com. So what's going on with the issue of creativity in a pandemic? I think what's true is that when the pandemic hit and the restrictions all came in, a lot of people felt like their normal activities were obviously affected, but also I think people were concerned about their ability to be creative and be innovative. And that's the interesting thing for me is that, are you ready? Get this. The pandemic actually created an environment for you to foster more creative thinking, not less. And in creativity training, we call it the principle of constraints, that constraints are a necessary condition for creativity to occur. And so first question is, how do you be creative in a pandemic? You got to put the constraints to good use. You got to put them and get them working for you. And let me give you an example. I found this example early in the pandemic, and it was a photo of a woman in a bikini, in a bathing suit, and she was standing on an ironing board that was nested inside of a hammock, and she was pretending like she was surfing. Well, it turns out she is a world-class surfer and living in California, and she has a big competition coming up overseas. And because of the restrictions of the pandemic, the beaches in California were closed. And so what can she do? What can she do to train? She's restricted to home. And this woman put together what I thought was a very creative solution of taking an ironing board, which is the shape of a surfboard, and nesting it in a hammock so she could practice her stances and moving side to side and riding the waves right there in her apartment. Pretty creative, and a great example of what people can do when they think through their constraints. So my advice to you, what this means for you in practice basically is look at the restrictions you have and harness those restrictions in this way. Think of it as you've heard the old adage, think outside the box. No, now think inside the box. And essentially what you have to do is look at the resources you have within this constrained environment. It's important that you mentally draw out your constraints, mentally imagine the boundaries of what you're constrained to. It could be constraints of time, money, scope, responsibility, or impact. It could be restrictions in terms of people you can contact or ways you can be in touch with people. Whatever your constraints are, draw a circle around it and know what envelope you can work within, with that zone you can work within. That's what you have to work with. One of the famous examples of this that comes up every so often is the famous Apollo mission, the Apollo 13 mission, where the three astronauts were stuck with a defective capsule, and they had to use just the elements they had on board to create a new way to create oxygen and survive the trip coming home. And they did it within the boundaries of those constraints. So a great example, it's one that we mention in our book, and one that we talk about this and many other examples of how you can harness constraints. Don't look at constraints as a barrier to creativity. Instead, look at constraints as a necessary driver to what you do. The next question that I get from time to time is one that I'm glad to see a lot of relief or a lot of improvement about how people are addressing this one, is how do you create and innovate with others when you're restricted to things like Zoom or Microsoft Teams? In other words, how do you do it virtually? And again, here I would tell you that the good news is the pandemic has forced a lot of us, all of us really, to get very familiar with the technology and being able to use things like Zoom to facilitate workshops, to do things like you would do with colleagues in a live conference room. The same thing you can do in Zoom and Microsoft Teams using breakout rooms and things like that. What's true is that to be creative, you have to remember what the act of creativity is. And all creativity is the simple combination of two previously unrelated themes. It's when two things come together and that didn't belong together, and now all of a sudden they are mashed together to form a potential idea that you then have to take a look at and figure out what value that it has to you. And so the way to get those creative ideas is to use some sort of structured method, like the one I talk a lot about in my LinkedIn courses, a method called systematic inventive thinking. It's based on patterns, and these patterns can help regulate your thinking for you, channel your ideation, and generate ideas for you that you wouldn't have generated otherwise. And you can use this type of method in a virtual scenario, just like you would use it in a live scenario. I think the important thing that I've learned in live workshops that I've applied in virtual workshops is this: you have to have good working processes, and techniques to make ideation happen more effectively. So, for example, one of the important things that I recommend you stop doing right away is don't ideate in large groups. When you get a group of people, say 10 people on a Zoom call, the worst thing you can do is just say, okay, folks, come on, we need to come up with some great ideas on how to address this business challenge. Or we need to come up with great ideas for this new product that we want to enhance. Just opening it up to a large group is not going to help you. In fact, it's going to hurt you. And this is based on years, some 60 years of research now about the effectiveness of open-ended techniques like brainstorming, which are, I'm sorry to tell you, they're just not that effective. And here's why. Working in a large group of 10 people is simply dysfunctional. Think about it. Wouldn't you be much better off to just take that group of 10 and break them down into small groups of, say, 2 or 3? Let's say you took a group of 10 and broke them into 5 groups of 2 and had each of those groups of 2 working on a part of the problem. Hey, I've got news for you. 5 pairs can outperform one group of 10 on any task. You name it. And a group of 5 pairs of 5 pairs, I should say, will outperform that same number of people working as a group of 10. Group of 10 is just dysfunctional. It's unproductive. Only one person can work at a time. There's so many reasons why you just don't want to work that way. So take advantage of the technology that you have with Zoom and Teams and WebEx to work into small groups, send them away into their breakout rooms, give them constrained time limits, and have people work in that scenario. They're going to be so much more effective. I mean, think about it. When you work in a pair with another person, let's say you are ideating online virtually with another person. What's interesting about the dynamic of pairs is that it's a safe environment. You feel a sense of accountability to the other person. You hold them accountable. They hold you accountable. You feel sort of a camaraderie. You want to help each other, build on each other's ideas. You're not getting any judgment or noise from from around the room. It's just you and the other person, and then it's over. And in a short period of time, just 2 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever, you and your partner have produced more ideas and better ideas than one large group of 10 could have. And this is a work practice on virtual programs that you have to follow. I think what's also true is you have to take advantage of the technologies virtually, like whiteboards, screen sharing, so that you can make good notes, good lists to use these tools correctly. You've got to outline the problem and the parts of the problem correctly and visually, so people can see what you're working on and be just as effective as you would if you were in a conference room at work. So take advantage of the technology, but use good work processes. In one of my courses on LinkedIn Learning, it's called Business Innovation Foundations. And there you can find a chapter and a video on running workshops. And that is still viable today. The same techniques you would use and learn in that video could help you in a virtual ideation session with your colleagues. Use the technology available to you. Now, if you have reviewed my courses or been a student of mine or a client or colleague, you know a little bit about this method that I work with so often, called systematic inventive thinking. This idea of patterns, how patterns have been used by mankind for thousands of years to create new ideas. What's interesting is these patterns are used by people many times without even knowing it. And when a person creates a new invention, a new idea, innovation, that pattern essentially is embedded into the product or service. It's like the DNA of the product or service. And with this method, S.I.T, you have the ability to extract that DNA and reapply it to anything you're trying to innovate. It's a beautiful thing. Works really well. Works great. It's the best method I've found anywhere to generate great ideas so quickly in so many domains. But the method is based on 5 patterns, and the question I get almost in every session I do is, which tool of the 5 do I want to use if I'm going to pick one? I only have time to use one. Let's say you only have an hour to work with somebody, or half a day. You're not going to be able, or nor would you want to use all 5 tools of the S.I.T method. It's just not going to be effective for you. So what you have to do is pick the right tool. I think what we tend to tell people is, look, any tool you pick of the 5 is going to work. All 5 will work in all situations. Now, that said, we've learned that certain tools are, let's say, preferred, the ones we tend to lean to. We use these guidelines to help us kick things off correctly. So, for example, if you're dealing with a situation that is, let's say, been around a long time, very mature, like a mature product or a situation that hasn't changed in a very long time. If you're dealing with anything that hasn't changed for a long time, the technique that we go to all the time is called subtraction. And subtraction forces you to take a component of that existing thing out and imagine what you would do without it. Great tool to reinvigorate new thinking into old, mature things that have been around a long time. So go with subtraction. It's a great tool, simple tool, but simple yet has to be used correctly to get the right effect. And it is the one we typically start all of our training sessions on to get people used to this method. In situations where you are resource constrained, like the pandemic, we tend to rely on a tool called task unification. Anytime you have resource constraints, which as far as my career has said, you always have some sort of resource constraints. And task unification just forces you to take a component right around you and repurpose it, unify it with some other tasks, make it do more work. It's a great tool. It yields so many interesting possibilities. For example, let me give you an idea of the one I use a lot. It's, if you look in your car, in the rear window of your car, what are you going to see? You're going to see small, thin wires running through the glass of the rear window. And if you live in cold climates, you know what that's for. That's the defroster for that window to melt any ice or snow that you get on it. But for many cars, guess what else that wire does? That wire is also the antenna for your radio. Many cars have used task unification to create a component, a simple wire, now to do not just the defrosting, but also the antenna reception, radio reception. Simple, but brilliant. And what's interesting is about cars in general is that cars in the last 10, 15 years have become so innovative because you'll see these patterns like task unification being used to create all kinds of new features and benefits in today's automobiles. Now, the technique we use in services, a very common question is, Drew, will this work on services? Maybe you're not in a product related industry. Maybe you work in financial services or healthcare services. If you're in a service industry, guess what? The same rules apply. There's no real difference between service marketing or service innovation and product innovation. You're still taking the tools of S.I.T and creating these unique combinations of things. But that said, the technique that we tend to go with a lot is called the division technique. And it works so well because it takes a part of the system, imagine it cuts it out physically or functionally and rearranges it back somewhere else. And with processes or services, essentially what it's doing, it's taking a step of the process and putting it somewhere else in the process. Now, no, it sounds crazy, but what it does is it illuminates new opportunities, maybe new information that you would learn or new people involved at a particular step of the process or the service. And so that's your go-to typically in process or service innovation. Also works great on products, but in the process of looking at your services, you want to start with the division technique. And the final piece of advice for today would be, what do you do when you have a product that you really want to make it more competitive? You want to get it, you want to jazz it up a little bit, I guess is the best way to put it. And in that scenario, the technique that we go to is called attribute dependency. Attribute dependency is that technique that makes you take a product or service, something about it, and cause it to change in relation to something else right around it. So it forces you to create this idea. As one thing changes, another thing changes. So imagine taking a product or a part of a system, and now it's going to do something that and change the way it works or change the way it looks or what it does in relation to something else that happened right around it. Let's go back to cars. You have windshield wipers, and for many cars today, the windshield wipers change speed. They speed up or slow down depending on the rain. And that is a classic example of the attribute dependency technique, making one thing change as another thing changes. This technique is the one you want to use when you want to make products that are smart, that are adjustable, that are customizable and adaptable to situations. And boy, it can be used on the simplest things to create a new insight, a feature of a product that just propels your product to a new level. So take a good look at the attribute dependency technique. Now, you can learn about all these techniques in several courses that I have here at LinkedIn. One in particular is called Creative Thinking. And in that, you'll learn all about all 5 of these techniques. I also want to invite you and remind you that my weekly podcast called Inside the Box comes out every Monday. You can subscribe to that through the usual channels, Spotify, Apple, Google, etc. So that is it for today, Live with Drew. We'll see you back on the next round, where I'm going to dive more into some of the marketing and branding topics and the questions I get from the learners that are attending these courses. Again, feel free to post any questions you have directly to me through LinkedIn or directly in email. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.